Dr. Patricia Williams stopped mid-examination, her magnifying glass frozen inches from Martha Henderson's forehead, the color draining from her face like water from a broken dam. What she saw defied 30 years of medical practice. Dozens of perfectly symmetrical holes, each no bigger than a pinhead, arranged in an impossible pattern across the elderly woman's skin. The nurse behind her gasped audibly, her metal tray clattering to the floor as surgical instruments scattered like fallen stars across the sterile tiles. Martha's weathered hands trembled as she watched the doctor's expression transform from professional confidence to something approaching terror, remembering how her late husband Tom used to look at her with such tenderness, never with this kind of fear. "Get Dr. Martinez on the phone immediately," Williams commanded, her voice cracking despite years of delivering difficult diagnoses, her mind racing between medical protocols and the growing certainty that this case would haunt her forever. What kind of nightmare had nested itself in this lonely widow's flesh? And how much time did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 weeks earlier, Martha Henderson sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun filtering through faded yellow curtains as she poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs, a ritual she couldn't break even 2 years after Tom's funeral. The second cup would grow cold, just like every morning since she'd buried her husband of 45 years, but somehow setting it out made the silence less deafening in their modest ranch home on Maple Street in Bakersfield. At 67, Martha had become a master of small economies and careful calculations. Her Social Security check of $1,247 arrived like clockwork on the 3rd Wednesday of each month, supplemented by Tom's meager pension that barely covered the mortgage on their 30-year-old home. The mathematics of survival had become her daily companion. $43 for groceries, $15 for utilities, $25 set aside for the heart medication that kept her ticking. What remained after the bills disappeared faster than morning dew, leaving her to choose between dignity and necessity with increasing frequency. The house felt too big now, filled with Tom's ghost and memories that seemed to echo from every corner. His favorite recliner sat empty in the living room, still bearing the impression of his body after all these months. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet, unwashed and waiting. Martha had stopped dusting his reading glasses on the nightstand, afraid that moving them might somehow erase the last traces of their life together. Her daughter Sarah lived a different existence entirely, 2,000 miles away in Seattle with her own problems, a recent divorce, 2 teenagers, and a demanding job at a tech company. Their last conversation 18 months ago had ended in harsh words and wounded pride. Sarah had wanted Martha to sell the house, move to assisted living, accept help like a sensible woman her age. "You can't tell me how to live my life," Martha had declared with the fierce independence that had carried her through 6 decades of marriage, motherhood, and now widowhood. The estrangement cut deeper than any physical ailment. Martha's phone rarely rang except for telemarketers and automated appointment reminders. She'd developed a careful routine to fill the empty hours: morning coffee with the Today Show, afternoon soap operas, evening news with a frozen dinner. Sundays meant church at First Methodist, where she sat in the same pew she'd shared with Tom, nodding politely at neighbors while declining their well-meaning invitations for coffee or dinner. Pride had become both her shield and her prison. When Mrs. Rodriguez next door offered to help with yard work or grocery shopping, Martha smiled graciously and insisted she was managing just fine, thank you very much. When the church ladies hinted about assistance programs for seniors, she changed the subject to the weather or the pastor's sermon. The thought of becoming someone's charity case, someone's burden, felt worse than any physical discomfort she might endure. In this carefully constructed world of routine and dignity, Martha maintained the illusion of independence while fighting a daily battle against loneliness, financial strain, and the creeping awareness that she was utterly, completely alone. Martha first noticed the small bumps on her forehead while applying her morning makeup, a ritual she'd maintained religiously even though visitors were as rare as California rain. 3 tiny raised spots, no bigger than pinheads, clustered near her hairline like unwelcome freckles that had appeared overnight. She pressed the concealer a little thicker, telling herself what she'd been telling herself about everything lately. At 67, everything's falling apart anyway. The bumps seemed insignificant compared to the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen counter. The electric company had sent their final notice, $48 past due, with a disconnection warning in bold red letters. Tom's remaining medical debt from his final hospital stay still haunted her mailbox, a constant reminder that death in America came with a payment plan. The Medicare statements arrived like clockwork, each one more confusing than the last, filled with codes and deductibles that made her head spin. When the bumps began to itch by the second week, Martha made her way to the pharmacy section of the local grocery store, standing in the fluorescent-lit aisle comparing prices on acne treatments designed for teenagers. $15 for a small tube of benzoyl peroxide seemed excessive, but what choice did she have? She counted out the bills from her worn leather wallet, knowing it meant choosing generic pasta over name brand for the rest of the month. "Just some hormonal changes," she murmured to her reflection that evening, dabbing the harsh medication onto her increasingly irritated skin. The mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, hollow cheeks where Tom used to kiss her goodnight, eyes that had lost their sparkle somewhere between the funeral and the endless parade of lonely days that followed. By the third week, the bumps had evolved into something more concerning. Small, angry red welts that wept clear fluid and crusted over during the night. Martha found herself waking with her fingernails digging into the inflamed skin, leaving scratches that only made the condition worse. The itching had become constant, a maddening sensation that followed her through grocery shopping, church services, and the long, empty hours of afternoon television. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on her door one Tuesday morning, holding a casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd been watching through her kitchen window. "Marta, you don't look so good, mija," she said in her gentle accent, eyes focusing on Martha's forehead where the makeup had begun to cake and flake around the sores. "Maybe you should see a doctor, no?" Martha's back stiffened with familiar pride. "I'm managing just fine, Elena." A few little bumps never killed anybody. But even as she spoke the words, her fingers unconsciously rose to touch the increasingly tender spots, now numbering nearly a dozen and spreading in a pattern she couldn't understand. The Medicare handbook became her evening reading, a maze of co-payments and deductibles that made her eyes water. A visit to the doctor would cost $45 up front, money she didn't have after paying the electric bill. The dermatologist, if needed, would require a referral and another copayment, plus whatever treatments they might prescribe. The mathematics of healthcare had become as complex as her daily survival budget. She tried everything the internet at the library suggested: tea tree oil that burned like fire, oatmeal masks that provided temporary relief, even toothpaste applied overnight in desperation. Nothing helped. The condition continued to spread, creating a constellation of sores across her forehead that no amount of makeup could hide. And the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the isolation. Martha had stopped attending church, too embarrassed by her appearance to face the congregation. Grocery shopping became a rushed ordeal, conducted with her head down and a baseball cap pulled low. She avoided mirrors when possible, and when she couldn't, she found herself staring at a stranger whose face had become a battlefield of inflamed skin and failed treatments. Sleep became elusive as the itching intensified. Martha would lie in bed clutching Tom's pillow, his final Christmas gift to her, a handmade cushion he'd found at the church charity shop and presented with such pride. "Something soft to remember me by, sweetheart," he'd said with that crooked smile she missed more than breathing. The pillow had become her comfort object, the one thing that made the empty bed feel less vast. As the sores multiplied and darkened, Martha began to suspect something more serious than aging skin. Cancer whispered through her mind during the sleepless 3 a.m. hours, followed by worse possibilities she'd found during her desperate internet searches. But the choice remained the same: seek expensive medical help she couldn't afford, or continue hoping that time and drugstore remedies would somehow solve what was becoming an increasingly frightening mystery written across her face. The fluorescent lights of Save Mart grocery store buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Martha pushed her cart down the cereal aisle, her baseball cap pulled low to hide the angry constellation of sores that had consumed nearly half her forehead. The infection had worsened dramatically over the past week, turning the small bumps into weeping wounds that crusted over each night and reopened each morning like some cruel daily resurrection of pain. She'd been standing in front of the generic oatmeal display, calculating whether she could afford both cereal and milk this week, when the world suddenly tilted sideways. The fluorescent lights seemed to pulse and blur. The linoleum floor rushed up to meet her, and Martha Henderson collapsed between the Cheerios and the store-brand cornflakes. "Ma'am? Ma'am? Can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from underwater. Martha opened her eyes to find a young store clerk kneeling beside her, his name tag reading Kevin, and his face etched with genuine concern. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, other shoppers peering down with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, some already reaching for their phones. "I'm fine," Martha whispered, attempting to sit up, but Kevin's gentle hand on her shoulder held her still. "Stay put, ma'am. I've called the paramedics. That's a pretty nasty cut on your head from when you fell." It was only then that Martha became aware of the warm trickle of blood running down her temple, mixing with the infected fluid from her existing sores. The ambulance ride to Mercy General cost her $147, money she didn't have. The emergency room visit would cost significantly more. As the paramedic checked her blood pressure and asked questions about her medical history, Martha found herself calculating costs instead of focusing on her health. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was literally too poor to afford being sick. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a tired-looking resident with kind eyes, examined Martha's forehead with poorly concealed alarm. "Mrs. Henderson, how long have you had these lesions?" "About a month," Martha replied, her voice hoarse. "Maybe 6 weeks. I thought they were just age spots or something." Dr. Martinez's latex gloves made a snapping sound as she adjusted them, leaning closer with a pen light. "This appears to be a significant bacterial infection, possibly with secondary complications. When did you last see your primary care physician?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Martha's Medicare card felt heavy in her wallet, a reminder of all the coverage it didn't provide. It's been a while. The copays are—" She trailed off, embarrassed by the admission of poverty to this young doctor who probably earned more in a week than Martha saw in months. "Ma'am, I need to be direct with you. This infection is serious. Without proper treatment, it could spread to your bloodstream. I'm going to prescribe antibiotics and give you a referral to our dermatology department, but you need to follow up within the next few days." The prescription slip felt like a death sentence when Martha saw the estimated cost at the hospital pharmacy. $68 for the antibiotics, $300 for the dermatology consultation, plus whatever additional treatments might be required. The emergency room bill would arrive later, probably exceeding $1,000. Back home that evening, Martha sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by medical paperwork and bills, Tom's coffee cup still sitting across from her like a silent witness to her despair. The antibiotics sat unopened in their pharmacy bag. She'd need to choose between the medication and keeping the electricity on. The dermatologist appointment card mocked her from beside the pile of overdue notices. She found herself talking to Tom's photograph on the mantel, a habit that had developed gradually over the past 2 years. "I don't know what to do, honey. If you were here, you'd know what to do." Her voice cracked as she touched the frame, remembering how he'd always handled their medical decisions with such confidence. That night, she clutched his final gift closer than ever, the handmade pillow he'd bought from the church charity shop during his last Christmas. The fabric was soft and worn, with intricate patterns that suggested foreign origins. Tom had been so proud of finding something special on his limited budget, something that would comfort her during the lonely nights ahead. "This will keep you company when I can't," he'd said, his eyes already showing the fatigue that would claim him just weeks later. The pillow had indeed become her constant companion, pressed against her cheek each night as she tried to find sleep in their suddenly too large bed. 3 days later, when the infection had spread and begun to emit a concerning odor, Martha made a decision that went against every fiber of her independent nature. She called Medicare's customer service line, spending 2 hours on hold before reaching a representative who spoke in acronyms and policy numbers. "Ma'am, you may qualify for emergency Medicaid assistance," the voice explained after Martha had described her situation with humiliating detail. "Your income level and medical emergency status could make you eligible for additional coverage." The revelation hit Martha like a physical blow. For years, she'd avoided government assistance programs, viewing them as handouts for people who hadn't worked hard enough or saved responsibly. Tom had shared that pride, that belief that accepting help meant admitting failure. But Tom was gone, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The application process took another week. Forms filled out with shaking hands, documents gathered from dusty filing cabinets, trips to government offices where she sat in plastic chairs surrounded by other desperate souls. Martha felt like she was betraying everything she and Tom had believed about self-reliance and dignity. But when the approval letter arrived along with the temporary Medicaid card, Martha cried for the first time since Tom's funeral. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, so profound it felt like resurrection. She could see the dermatologist. She could afford the treatments. She could stop choosing between medication and groceries. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday with Dr. Patricia Williams, a dermatologist with 3 decades of experience. Martha marked the date on her calendar with a red pen, circling it like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. As she prepared for bed that night, pressing Tom's pillow against her infected forehead in a ritual of comfort she'd maintained every night for 2 years, Martha whispered a prayer of gratitude mixed with apprehension. She had no way of knowing that the very object bringing her comfort was slowly, methodically destroying her from within. The pattern of holes across her forehead had begun to form a recognizable shape, though Martha couldn't see it herself. It would take a trained medical professional to recognize what was tunneling beneath her skin, turning her flesh into a roadmap of something far more sinister than simple bacterial infection. The 3 weeks between Martha's emergency room visit and her dermatology appointment stretched like an eternity, punctuated by sleepless nights and mounting dread. The antibiotics had helped reduce the immediate inflammation, but the underlying pattern of holes continued to spread across her forehead with mathematical precision, forming what looked like tiny tunnels beneath her skin. Martha spent hours at the library's computer, researching her symptoms with the desperate determination of someone who knew time was running out. WebMD became her obsession and her torment. Each search led to increasingly terrifying possibilities: necrotizing fasciitis, aggressive skin cancers, autoimmune disorders that could ravage her body within months. She printed articles about flesh-eating bacteria and skin tumors, stuffing them into a manila folder that grew thicker with each visit to the library. The photos she found online haunted her dreams, images of faces destroyed by conditions that started exactly like hers. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford, not just financially but physically. The infected areas itched with an intensity that defied description, a burning sensation that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Martha would lie in bed holding Tom's pillow against her cheek, pressing the soft fabric against the uninfected side of her face, while her fingernails unconsciously scratched at the spreading sores. She'd wake each morning to find dried blood under her nails and new scratches that had reopened during the night. The isolation deepened as her appearance deteriorated. Martha stopped attending First Methodist entirely, unable to face the concerned glances and whispered conversations she imagined following her every move. Mrs. Rodriguez had knocked 3 more times, each visit more insistent than the last, but Martha pretended not to be home, watching through her blinds as her neighbor finally gave up and walked away with obvious concern etched on her weathered face. Grocery shopping became a military operation conducted at dawn when the store was nearly empty. Martha would pull her baseball cap low and navigate the aisles with her head down, grabbing necessities as quickly as possible. The few times other customers noticed her condition, she caught them staring with a mixture of pity and revulsion that made her want to disappear entirely. One elderly man actually stepped backward when she approached, as if her condition might be contagious. The phone calls she didn't make weighed heavier than the ones she did. Sarah's number remained in Martha's contacts, unchanged after 18 months of silence. Several times she'd picked up the receiver, dialed the first few digits, then hung up before completing the call. What would she say? How could she explain that the independent mother who'd refused help was now literally falling apart? The pride that had driven them apart now felt like a wall too high to climb. Pastor Wilson arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, his gentle knock distinctive from the persistent rapping of bill collectors and salespeople. Martha considered not answering, but something about his presence compelled her to open the door, keeping her face angled away from the afternoon light. "Martha, honey, we've missed you at service," he said in his soft Tennessee drawl, his eyes immediately focusing on her forehead with barely concealed shock. "The congregation has been asking after you?" She invited him in reluctantly, serving coffee in Tom's favorite cups while trying to position herself so the light wouldn't highlight the worst areas of infection. Pastor Wilson was in his 70s himself, a man who'd seen enough suffering to recognize when someone was drowning in their own pride. "You know, Martha, there's no shame in accepting help when the Lord provides it," he said carefully, his hands wrapped around the ceramic mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the coffee. "The church has discretionary funds for medical emergencies. Tom was a faithful member for 30 years. He'd want us to care for his widow." The offer hung between them like a bridge Martha was afraid to cross. "I appreciate that, Pastor, but I'm managing. The Lord helps those who help themselves." Pastor Wilson's weathered face creased into a sad smile. "That's actually not biblical, dear. That's Benjamin Franklin. The Bible says bear one another's burdens. Sometimes being helped is harder than helping, but both are acts of faith." After he left, Martha sat in Tom's recliner for the first time since the funeral, sinking into the worn leather that still held the faint scent of his cologne. The pastor's words echoed in her mind, fighting against decades of ingrained self-reliance. Tom had been proud. They both had been. But Tom had also been practical. Would he really want her to suffer alone rather than accept help from people who cared about them? The fever started on a Sunday night, beginning as a slight warmth that she attributed to the heater running too high. By Monday morning, it had escalated to full chills that left her shaking beneath layers of blankets. The infected areas on her forehead felt hot to the touch, radiating heat that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. Martha knew she was in trouble, but the dermatology appointment was only 24 hours away. She made it through Monday night by dosing herself with acetaminophen and staying hydrated, but Tuesday morning brought a terrifying realization: the pattern of holes had doubled in size overnight. What had been confined to her forehead was now creeping toward her temples, creating an intricate network of small tunnels beneath her skin that seemed to follow some invisible blueprint. At the library that morning, using their computer for what might be her final research session, Martha discovered something that made her blood run cold. The pattern emerging on her face resembled photos she found of parasitic infections, specifically something called cutaneous larva migrans, where parasitic larvae create tunnels beneath the skin. The images showed the same serpentine patterns, the same small holes, the same progression she was experiencing. But the condition was typically found in tropical regions, contracted through contact with contaminated soil or materials. Martha had never left California, had no exposure to exotic parasites or foreign diseases. The disconnect between her research and her reality left her more confused and frightened than ever. That afternoon, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Martha called Pastor Wilson and accepted the church's offer of financial assistance. Her voice shook as she explained her situation, her need for expensive treatments, her fear of what might happen if the infection continued to spread. "We'll have a check ready by this afternoon," Pastor Wilson assured her. "And Martha, you're not alone in this. Tom would be proud of you for accepting help when you need it." The dermatology office at Mercy General felt like stepping into another world, one of gleaming surfaces and hushed efficiency, where people in scrubs moved with practiced urgency. Martha checked in with her new Medicaid card and the church's check for additional expenses, feeling simultaneously grateful and ashamed of her dependence on charity. Dr. Patricia Williams's reputation preceded her: 30 years of experience, published researcher, the kind of specialist who saw cases that stumped other doctors. Martha had read her credentials online, finding comfort in the doctor's expertise while dreading what such an expert might discover. In the examination room, Martha removed her baseball cap for the first time in weeks outside her own home. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting every tunnel, every hole, every angry red patch of infected skin. She closed her eyes and waited for Dr. Williams to enter, clutching Tom's pillow against her chest like a talisman against whatever terrible truth was about to be revealed. The appointment that would change everything was less than an hour away. Martha had no way of knowing that the comfort object she'd been pressing against her face every night was the source of her torment, or that the answer to her mysterious condition lay not in some exotic disease contracted in foreign lands, but in the loving gesture of a dying husband who'd unknowingly purchased her destruction from a church charity shop. As she sat in that sterile examination room, fevering and frightened, Martha whispered a prayer to Tom's memory. "Help me be strong enough for whatever comes next." She had no idea that strength would mean letting go of the very thing that connected her to him, or that healing would require destroying the last physical reminder of their love. Dr. Patricia Williams entered the examination room with the confident stride of someone who had diagnosed thousands of skin conditions over 3 decades of practice. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes held the kind of clinical compassion that came from years of delivering both good news and devastating diagnoses. Martha sat rigidly on the examination table, her baseball cap finally removed, revealing the full extent of the damage to her forehead. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I'm Dr. Williams." She pulled on latex gloves with practiced efficiency, then stopped mid-motion as her eyes focused on Martha's forehead. The confident expression faltered for just a moment, a crack in the professional facade that Martha didn't miss. "Let's take a closer look," Dr. Williams said, her voice carefully controlled as she wheeled a magnifying lamp closer to the examination table. The bright light illuminated the dozens of small holes that now covered nearly half of Martha's forehead, each one perfectly round and arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns beneath the skin. Martha watched the doctor's face as she examined the lesions, noting how Dr. Williams' eyebrows drew together in concentration, then confusion, then something approaching alarm. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the busy medical office. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Williams said finally, straightening up and removing her gloves, "I need to ask you some very specific questions. Have you traveled outside the United States in the past 6 months?" "No," Martha replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't left California in over 2 years." "Have you been in contact with anyone who has recently traveled to tropical regions? South America, perhaps, or parts of Africa or Southeast Asia?" Martha shook her head, confusion evident in her eyes. "Doctor, I barely leave my house anymore. The only people I see are neighbors and folks from church. What are you thinking this might be?" Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying the pattern on Martha's forehead with an intensity that made Martha's stomach clench with fear. "I need to call some colleagues," she said finally. "What you're presenting with is unusual. I want to get some other opinions before we proceed." The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Dr. Williams stepped out to make phone calls, her voice carrying through the thin walls in urgent whispers that Martha couldn't quite make out. Within 20 minutes, the small examination room was crowded with medical professionals, a second dermatologist, an infectious disease specialist, and a tropical medicine expert, who had been hastily summoned from the University Medical Center. Martha sat in the center of this medical storm, feeling increasingly small and frightened as cameras flashed and the doctors took detailed photographs of her condition. They spoke in medical terminology that flew over her head, words like subcutaneous migration patterns and parasitic larvae and cutaneous larva migrans. "Mrs. Henderson," said Dr. James Chen, the infectious disease specialist, "we believe you have a parasitic infection called cutaneous larva migrans. It's caused by the larvae of hookworms that typically infect animals. The larvae migrate under your skin, creating these tunnel-like patterns." Martha's hand instinctively rose to touch her forehead, then stopped short of the infected area. "But how is that possible?" "I thought you said this comes from tropical places." "That's what makes your case so unusual," Dr. Williams interjected. "This condition is almost exclusively found in people who have had direct contact with contaminated sand or soil in tropical regions. Beaches in the Caribbean, certain areas of South America, parts of Africa. The larvae are typically found in areas where dogs and cats defecate on warm, moist sand or soil." "I haven't been anywhere like that," Martha insisted, her voice rising with a mixture of confusion and fear. "I live in Bakersfield. The most exotic place I've been lately is the grocery store." Dr. Chen leaned forward in his chair, his expression gentle but serious. "We need to figure out the source of your exposure, Mrs. Henderson. Can you think of anything you might have come into contact with that could have originated from a tropical region? Imported goods, perhaps? Clothing, textiles, anything that might have been shipped from South America or similar climates?" Martha's mind raced through her limited recent purchases: groceries, generic medications from the pharmacy, a few household items from the dollar store. Nothing seemed to fit the exotic profile the doctors were describing. "I don't buy imported things," she said helplessly. "I can't afford to shop anywhere fancy." The tropical medicine expert, Dr. Maria Santos, spoke up from where she'd been examining the photographs. "Sometimes the exposure can be indirect. Have you been in contact with anyone who might have brought back items from tropical regions? Family members? Friends?" "I don't have much contact with anyone," Martha admitted, the words stinging as she spoke them. "My daughter lives in Seattle and we don't talk much. My husband passed away 2 years ago. I mostly keep to myself. The room fell quiet as the medical team absorbed this information. Doctor, Williams made notes in Martha's chart while the other specialists continued to study the photographs and discuss treatment options in hushed tones. The good news, Dr. Williams said finally, is that this condition is treatable. We'll need to prescribe antiparasitic medication, specifically a drug called albendazole or ivermectin. The treatment course typically runs 10 to 14 days. Martha felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by the familiar anxiety about costs. How much will that run? Dr. Chen consulted his phone, checking medication prices. The albendazole will be approximately $800 for the full course. Ivermectin is slightly less expensive, around $600. Your insurance should cover a significant portion. Even with Medicare and the emergency Medicaid coverage, Martha knew there would be substantial out-of-pocket costs. The church's assistance would help, but she could feel the weight of financial obligations settling on her shoulders once again. There's something else we need to discuss, Dr. Santos added carefully. This type of parasitic infection doesn't just appear randomly. The larvae have to come from somewhere specific. Contaminated soil or materials that have been in contact with infected animal feces in tropical regions. We need to identify the source to prevent reinfection and to determine if anyone else might be at risk. The doctors began a methodical investigation into every aspect of Martha's recent life. They asked about her food sources, her water supply, any construction or landscaping in her neighborhood. They inquired about packages she might have received, second-hand items she'd purchased, even her garbage and recycling habits. What about bedding? Dr. Williams asked. Pillows, blankets, anything that you might have acquired recently that could have been imported? Martha's blood ran cold as the question triggered a memory she'd been suppressing. Tom's final Christmas gift, the handmade pillow he'd found at the church charity shop. The pillow she'd been pressing against her face every single night for over 2 years. The pillow with the intricate patterns that had always seemed foreign, exotic, beautiful, in a way that spoke of distant places and skilled craftsmanship. Martha started, then stopped, unable to form the words that would connect her beloved comfort object to this medical nightmare. Mrs. Henderson? Dr. Williams prompted gently. What is it? My husband, Martha whispered, her voice breaking. Before he died, he gave me a pillow, handmade from the church charity shop. I've been sleeping with it every night since he passed. The medical team exchanged meaningful glances. Dr. Santos leaned forward with renewed interest. Can you describe this pillow? Do you remember anything about where it might have come from originally? Martha closed her eyes, picturing Tom's proud smile as he'd presented his final gift. It was beautiful, she said softly. Intricate patterns, looked like it might have been made somewhere. Foreign. Tom said he found it at St. Mary's charity shop. He was so proud of finding something special on his budget. We're going to need to examine that pillow, Dr. Williams said firmly. And Mrs. Henderson, until we can determine if it's the source of your infection, you need to stop using it immediately. Don't touch it with bare hands. Don't put it near your face. We'll arrange for it to be collected for laboratory analysis. The words hit Martha like physical blows. The pillow, Tom's final gesture of love, her nightly comfort, the one thing that made the empty bed bearable, was potentially the source of her suffering. The cruel irony was almost too much to process. The object that connected her to her husband's memory was literally eating her alive from within. As the medical team continued their discussion about treatment protocols and follow-up care, Martha sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the love behind Tom's gift with the horror of what it had apparently caused. How could something given with such tenderness become an instrument of such destruction? The ride home from Dr. Williams' office felt like a funeral procession, with Martha clutching the prescription papers and laboratory collection instructions while her mind reeled from the impossible reality she now faced. Tom's final gift, the beautiful handmade pillow that had been her sole comfort through 2 years of grief, was slowly killing her from within. The cruel irony cut deeper than any physical pain she'd endured, transforming every cherished memory of his thoughtfulness into a nightmare of unintended consequences. Back in her empty house, Martha stood in the doorway of their bedroom, staring at the pillow resting innocently against the headboard where she'd left it that morning. The intricate patterns that had once seemed so beautiful now looked sinister, like a map of the destruction spreading across her face. She could see Tom's hands smoothing the fabric as he'd presented it to her, his eyes bright with the joy of giving something special despite their limited means. "Something soft to remember me by, sweetheart," he'd said, and Martha had pressed it against her cheek, breathing in the faint scent of the charity shop, a mixture of old fabric and other people's memories. For 24 months, that pillow had been her anchor to their shared life, the one thing that made the vast emptiness of their bed bearable. Now she couldn't even touch it without protective gloves. The insurance nightmare began before she'd even gotten home. Dr. Williams's office called while Martha was still sitting in her car in the driveway, staring at her house with new eyes, seeing it as the scene of a slow-motion poisoning she'd never recognized. "Mrs. Henderson, I have some concerning news about your treatment coverage," said Jessica, the insurance coordinator, her voice professionally sympathetic but ultimately powerless. "Medicare is classifying your condition as an experimental treatment scenario because cutaneous larva migrans is so rare in domestic cases. They're requiring pre-authorization for the albendazole, which could take up to 10 days. 10 days? Martha's voice cracked. "The doctor said I needed to start treatment immediately. I understand your concern, but the insurance company needs to verify that this is the most cost-effective treatment option. The alternative is to pay out of pocket and seek reimbursement later, but there's no guarantee they'll approve the claim retroactively." Martha ended the call and sat in her driveway, surrounded by the detritus of American healthcare. Prescription papers, insurance cards, referral forms, and a diagnosis that her own insurance company didn't quite believe. The albendazole would cost $847 out of pocket. Her checking account contained $300. Inside the house, she called the church office with shaking hands, swallowing what remained of her pride as she explained her situation to Pastor Wilson's secretary. The discretionary fund could provide another $500, but even combined with her available cash, she'd still be $35 short, a seemingly insignificant amount that might as well have been $35,000. That afternoon brought another devastating blow. Dr. Williams called personally with the results of the laboratory analysis that had been rushed through the University Medical Center. The pillow tested positive for hookworm larvae, specifically a South American strain that typically infected dogs and cats in tropical regions. "Mrs. Henderson, we've traced the pillow's origin through the charity shop's records," Dr. Williams explained, her voice gentle but clinical. "It was donated as part of an estate sale from a family who had recently returned from missionary work in Ecuador. The pillow was likely contaminated with soil or animal waste during their time there." The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Some well-meaning missionary family had brought home a beautiful handmade pillow as a souvenir, never knowing it carried microscopic hitchhikers. When they donated their belongings, the charity shop had no way of knowing the danger hidden within the lovely handicraft. Tom, looking for something special to comfort his grieving wife, had chosen the most beautiful item he could afford. "The larvae can remain dormant in fabric for years," Dr. Williams continued, Your nightly contact with the pillow, especially pressing it against your face, provided the perfect conditions for them to penetrate your skin and begin their migration patterns. Martha hung up the phone and walked into the bedroom like a woman approaching her own execution. The pillow sat there, indifferent to the chaos it had caused, its intricate patterns now revealed as highways for the parasites that had made her face their hunting ground. She needed to bag it for final disposal, but first she had to say goodbye to the last tangible connection to her husband's love. The phone rang again. This time it was Sarah. "Mom?" Her daughter's voice was strained, distant, not just geographically, but emotionally. "I got a call from someone at Mercy General. They said you'd listed me as your emergency contact for some kind of treatment authorization." "What's going on?" Martha closed her eyes, realizing that the hospital's attempts to expedite her insurance approval had triggered an automatic notification system. After 18 months of silence, their first conversation would be about her medical crisis, exactly the kind of burden she'd sworn never to become. "It's nothing you need to worry about, honey," Martha said automatically, the lie coming easily after decades of maternal protection. "Just some routine tests. Mom, they called me about parasitic infection and experimental treatments." "That doesn't sound routine." Sarah's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd inherited her mother's stubbornness along with her father's analytical mind. "What aren't you telling me?" The conversation that followed shattered what remained of Martha's carefully constructed independence. Sarah, working in tech and managing her own financial struggles after a messy divorce, listened with growing horror as Martha described the past 2 months. The spreading infection, the financial calculations, the charity assistance, the insurance denials. "Why didn't you call me?" Sarah's voice broke with a mixture of anger and anguish. "I'm your daughter. I should have known you were suffering. You made it clear you wanted me to handle my own problems," Martha replied, the old wounds reopening with surgical precision. "You wanted me to sell the house, move to some facility, stop being so stubborn about accepting help. I wanted you to be safe. I wanted you to have support." "I never wanted you to." Sarah's voice dissolved into tears. "Oh God, Mom, what have we done to each other?" The brutal honesty that followed laid bare 18 months of mutual pride and stubborn love. Sarah revealed her own struggles, the divorce that had left her financially strapped, the demanding job that consumed her energy, the guilt over not calling that had grown into a wall she couldn't climb. Martha confessed her terror of being a burden, her desperate need to maintain dignity, her crushing loneliness that made every day feel like drowning in slow motion. "I'm flying out tomorrow," Sarah declared, her voice regaining strength through decision. "I'm taking family leave, and I'm staying until we figure this out. And Mom, we're going to pay for your medication. I don't care what it costs." "Sarah, honey, you can't afford—" "Neither can you, apparently. This is what families do. We help each other." "Dad would be furious at both of us for letting pride almost kill you." That evening, as Martha waited for Sarah's arrival and tried to process the earthquake that had shattered her carefully ordered world, she stood once more in the bedroom doorway. The pillow needed to be properly bagged and disposed of according to the medical team's instructions, but she couldn't bring herself to touch even the plastic bags Dr. Williams had provided. Instead, she found herself talking to Tom's photograph on the nightstand, her voice raw with grief and confusion. "How could something you gave me with so much love cause so much pain? How could the thing that helped me remember you be the thing that's destroying me?" The house felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending change. Sarah was coming home for the first time since the funeral, carrying her own burdens and regrets. The pillow that had been Martha's comfort would be incinerated as medical waste. The insurance battle would continue, but now she wouldn't fight it alone. As night fell, Martha made a bed for herself on the living room couch, unable to sleep in the bedroom where Tom's contaminated gift waited for disposal. She'd spent 2 years pressing that pillow against her face, breathing in what she'd thought were harmless memories, never knowing that love itself could be toxic when filtered through ignorance and terrible luck. Tomorrow would bring Sarah, difficult conversations, and the beginning of treatment that might save her life. But tonight, Martha lay awake, grieving not just for her health or her independence, but for the innocent belief that love could never harm the people we treasure most. Sometimes, she was learning, the most dangerous gifts come wrapped in the best intentions. Sarah's rental car pulled into the driveway at 6:47 a.m., nearly 2 hours ahead of her scheduled arrival, and Martha watched through the living room blinds as her daughter sat motionless behind the wheel for several minutes, gathering courage for a reunion neither of them had imagined would happen under such circumstances. When Sarah finally emerged, Martha was struck by how much older she looked. The divorce and single motherhood had carved lines around her eyes that hadn't been there at Tom's funeral, and her once confident posture now carried the weight of someone who'd learned that life could collapse without warning. The embrace on Martha's front porch lasted longer than any hug they'd shared in years, with both women crying openly for the first time since Tom's death. Sarah pulled back to examine her mother's face, her expression cycling through shock, grief, and barely contained anger at the extent of the infection that now covered nearly half of Martha's forehead in an intricate pattern of holes and inflamed tissue. "Oh, Mom," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you suffer through this alone?" The next few hours unfolded like a careful archaeological dig through 18 months of mutual silence and accumulated resentment. Sarah moved through the house with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, noting the overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter, the nearly empty refrigerator, the careful economies that spoke of genuine hardship rather than mere frugality. "I had no idea it was this bad," Sarah said, sitting across from Martha at the kitchen table where Tom's second coffee cup still waited each morning. "When you wouldn't return my calls after the funeral, I thought you were angry about the assisted living suggestion. I never imagined you were struggling financially." Martha poured coffee with shaking hands, the tremor more pronounced now that her secret was fully exposed. "Your father always handled the money. I thought the life insurance and his pension would be enough. I didn't realize how much his final medical bills would eat into everything we'd saved." The conversation that followed revealed layers of miscommunication and wounded pride that had festered for nearly 2 years. Sarah had assumed Martha's silence meant independence and anger. Martha had interpreted Sarah's absence as rejection and disappointment. Both had been too stubborn to bridge a gap that had grown wider with each passing month. Sarah's investigation into Martha's medical situation revealed another devastating truth. The insurance pre-authorization had been denied entirely. Medicare's determination was final. Cutaneous larva migrans acquired through domestic exposure was classified as an investigational condition, and the expensive anti-parasitic medications were not covered under standard benefits. "This is insane," Sarah said, scrolling through the insurance company's rejection letter on her phone, while Martha sat in defeated silence. "They're basically saying they don't believe you contracted a tropical disease in Bakersfield, so they won't pay for the cure." The cost calculation was brutal in its simplicity. The albendazole would cost $847 out of pocket. Follow-up appointments and potential complications could add another $500. Sarah's divorce settlement had left her with exactly $200 in emergency savings, money she'd been hoarding against the possibility of job loss or her children's unexpected needs. "I'll figure it out, honey," Martha said, watching her daughter's internal struggle play out across her face. "Maybe, doctor." "Williams can find a generic version or—" "No!" Sarah's voice carried the same steel that had characterized Martha's own stubborn independence. We're getting you the medication today. I don't care what it costs." But Martha could see the fear behind her daughter's determination, the same financial anxiety that had plagued their family for months before Tom's death. Sarah was choosing between her mother's health and her own family's security, just as Martha had been choosing between medication and electricity for weeks. That afternoon brought an unexpected intervention that would change everything. Dr. Williams called Martha's house directly, asking to speak with both mother and daughter. Her voice carried an unusual weight, as if she'd been struggling with a decision that went beyond normal medical protocol. "I've been thinking about your case all night, Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Williams said, her words carefully chosen. "What I'm about to tell you is personal, not professional, and I need you to understand that distinction." Sarah took Martha's hand as Dr. Williams continued, her voice thick with emotion that seemed to surprise even herself. 15 years ago, I lost my own mother to a treatable condition because she couldn't afford the medication. Diabetes complications that could have been prevented with insulin she couldn't buy on her fixed income. She died rather than ask for help, and I was too busy building my career to realize how desperate her situation had become. Martha's breath caught as she recognized her own story reflected in the doctor's pain. I became a physician to help people, but I've watched our healthcare system turn healing into a luxury good that only some people can afford. Your case, a woman suffering because love became contaminated with poverty. It's everything wrong with how we treat the elderly in this country. Dr. Williams paused, and Martha could hear her taking a steadying breath before continuing. "I'm going to treat you pro bono, Mrs. Henderson. The medication, the follow-up care, everything. My practice will absorb the costs. But more importantly, I want your permission to document your case for publication. Your story needs to be told. How medical debt isolates our elderly. How pride becomes deadly when healthcare is unaffordable. How love itself can become toxic in a system that prioritizes profit over healing." Sarah was crying openly now, and Martha felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of human kindness. Here was a stranger willing to sacrifice financially to save her, motivated by grief and professional frustration with a system that had failed both their families. "Why would you do this for me?" Martha whispered. "Because your suffering is preventable, and your story matters." "Because I can afford to help, and my mother would want me to use my privilege to prevent other families from experiencing what we went through." The medication arrived that afternoon, delivered personally by Dr. Williams, who spent an hour explaining the treatment protocol while Sarah took detailed notes. The albendazole would kill the parasitic larvae over a 10-day course, but the healing process would take weeks, and the scars would likely be permanent. "The most important thing," Dr. Williams emphasized, "is that we've caught it before systemic infection occurred. A few more weeks, and the larvae could have spread to other organs." That evening, as Martha took her first dose of medication that had seemed impossibly out of reach just hours earlier, she and Sarah sat in the living room dealing with the pillow that had started everything. Following medical protocol, they carefully bagged Tom's final gift using protective equipment Dr. Williams had provided, treating it like the biohazard it had unknowingly become. "I keep thinking about Dad buying this," Sarah said, her voice heavy with complicated grief. "How proud he was to find something beautiful for you. How much love went into that choice." Martha touched the plastic bag containing the pillow, her gloved fingers tracing the outline of the intricate patterns that had once brought comfort and now represented 2 years of slow poisoning. "He wanted me to have something soft to remember him by. He had no way of knowing it would nearly kill me." The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. They were literally destroying the last physical remnant of Tom's love in order to save Martha's life. But as they sealed the bag for medical disposal, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling like they were erasing Tom's memory, it felt like they were finally honoring his true intention: to keep Martha safe and loved. "Dad didn't want you to suffer alone with a contaminated pillow," Sarah said, verbalizing what they both understood. "He wanted you to be surrounded by people who care about you. He wanted you to accept help when you need it. He wanted you to live." That night, for the first time in over 2 years, Martha didn't sleep with Tom's pillow pressed against her face. Instead, she fell asleep on the couch while Sarah dozed in Tom's old recliner, both of them finally understanding that love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go of the things that harm us, even when they come wrapped in the best intentions. The medication was already beginning its work, and Martha could feel the first stirrings of hope she'd experienced since Tom's death. Tomorrow would bring continued treatment, difficult conversations about the future, and the beginning of a relationship rebuilt on honesty rather than pride. But tonight, she was no longer alone. 6 months later, Martha Henderson stood in the bathroom of her new apartment in Seattle, examining her reflection in the morning light that streamed through windows she'd never expected to see. The scars on her forehead had settled into a pattern of small, pale circles, permanent reminders of her ordeal that she'd initially tried to hide with makeup, but had gradually learned to wear like badges of survival. The infection was gone, the parasites killed by Dr. Williams's intervention, but the marks they'd left behind told a story that Martha now understood was worth telling. The apartment was small but comfortable, part of a senior living community just 15 minutes from Sarah's house. Close enough for daily contact, but far enough to maintain the independence that Martha still cherished. The decision to sell the Bakersfield house had been difficult but necessary, allowing her to pay off Tom's medical debts and establish a fresh start in a city where help was readily available and pride could coexist with practical support. "Morning, Mom," Sarah called from the kitchen where she was preparing coffee for two, a ritual they'd re-established after years of interruption. The financial strain of Martha's medical crisis had ultimately brought them closer together, forcing both women to confront the walls they'd built around their grief and stubbornness. Martha joined her daughter at the small dining table, accepting the ceramic mug with gratitude that had become easier to express over the past months. The Medicare battle had ultimately been resolved in their favor, thanks partly to Dr. Williams's documentation and partly to a wave of media attention that had followed Martha's case. Her story had become a symbol of healthcare inequality and the hidden struggles of America's elderly population. "The reporter from the Washington Post wants to do a follow-up interview next week," Sarah mentioned, scrolling through her phone while sipping her coffee. "They're interested in how the Medicare policy changes have affected other patients with rare tropical diseases." Martha nodded, still adjusting to her unexpected role as a healthcare advocate. Dr. Williams had been true to her word about documenting the case, and the resulting medical journal publication had sparked broader conversations about insurance coverage for unusual conditions. More importantly, it had led to policy changes that would prevent other elderly patients from facing the same impossible choices between treatment and financial survival. The doorbell rang, interrupting their morning routine. Martha opened it to find Mrs. Chen, her neighbor from 2 apartments down, holding a casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression that had become familiar over the past few months. "I made too much chicken and rice again," Mrs. Chen said with a smile that didn't quite hide her genuine worry. "Are you feeling well today, Martha? You look a little tired." The lie came automatically to Martha's lips. "I'm fine, thank you." But she caught herself before speaking. The past 6 months had taught her that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, and that community support could be the difference between thriving and merely surviving. "Actually, I had a rough night," Martha admitted, accepting the casserole with genuine gratitude. The anniversary of Tom's diagnosis is coming up and it always makes me restless, but this smells wonderful. Would you like to join Sarah and me for coffee? The invitation surprised all three women, but Mrs. Chen's pleased acceptance reminded Martha of how much she'd isolated herself during those final months in Bakersfield. The senior community had become a network of mutual support, with residents checking on each other and sharing resources in ways that Martha had once viewed as intrusive, but now recognized as essential. That afternoon, Martha volunteered at the nonprofit organization that Dr. Williams had established in the wake of Martha's case. The Center for Elderly Healthcare Advocacy occupied a small office in downtown Seattle, staffed primarily by retired medical professionals and patients who had navigated similar insurance battles. Martha's role involved speaking with elderly callers who were struggling to afford medications or understand coverage options. "Mrs. Henderson, I have a gentleman on line 3 who's dealing with a Medicare denial for his wife's diabetes medication," said Jennifer, the center's coordinator. "He specifically asked to speak with you after hearing your story on NPR." Martha settled at her desk, putting on the headset that had become as familiar as her morning coffee routine. These conversations never got easier. Each one reminded her of her own desperation during those terrible months, but they had given her a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since Tom's death. "This is Martha Henderson. How can I help you today?" The voice on the other end belonged to Robert Martinez, a 73-year-old widower whose wife Carmen was rationing her insulin because they couldn't afford the full monthly supply. The story was achingly familiar. Fixed income, rising medication costs, pride preventing them from seeking help until a medical crisis forced their hand. "I heard you on the radio talking about how you almost died because you couldn't afford treatment," Robert said, his voice thick with the kind of shame Martha recognized from her own experience. "Carmen keeps saying she's fine, but I can see she's getting sicker. I don't know what to do." Martha spent 40 minutes walking Robert through the resources available, helping him navigate Medicare's supplemental programs and connecting him with local assistance organizations. But more importantly, she shared her own story. The months of suffering alone, the pride that nearly killed her, and the hard-learned lesson that accepting help was often the most loving thing she could do for the people who cared about her. "Your wife is scared," Martha told him gently. "Not just of being sick, but of being a burden. I understand that fear because I lived it. But Robert, the greatest burden you can place on someone who loves you is making them watch you suffer when help is available." After the call ended, Martha sat quietly at her desk, thinking about the strange path that had led her from isolated widow to community advocate. The parasitic infection that had nearly killed her had also connected her to a network of people fighting similar battles, not just against disease, but against a healthcare system that too often treated elderly patients as disposable. That evening, Sarah joined Martha for dinner at the apartment, bringing takeout from the Thai restaurant that had become their weekly tradition. Over pad Thai and spring rolls, they talked about Martha's day at the center, Sarah's ongoing divorce proceedings, and the grandchildren Martha was finally getting to know properly. "Emma asked me today why Grandma Martha has spots on her face," Sarah mentioned carefully, referring to her 8-year-old daughter. "I wasn't sure how much to explain." Martha touched her forehead automatically, feeling the raised scars that would never fully fade. "Tell her they're reminders," she said after a moment. "Reminders that sometimes we have to survive difficult things to learn how to help other people." The conversation turned to Martha's medical checkup scheduled for the following week, her 6-month follow-up with Dr. Williams to ensure the infection hadn't returned. The relationship between patient and doctor had evolved into something approaching friendship, bound by their shared commitment to healthcare advocacy and their mutual understanding of loss. Dr. Williams mentioned that the medical journal wants to publish a follow-up study, Sarah said. Your case has apparently influenced treatment protocols for tropical diseases in non-endemic areas. They're calling it the Henderson Protocol for investigating domestic exposure sources. Martha smiled at the irony of having a medical procedure named after her. Tom would have been simultaneously proud and amazed that his widow had become a small footnote in medical history, though she suspected he would have preferred she achieve fame through less painful means. As Sarah prepared to leave for the evening, she paused at the door with the expression that had become familiar over the past months, a mixture of relief and lingering worry that Martha might somehow disappear back into isolation. "Mom, you know you can call me any time, right? Day or night, if you need anything or just want to talk. We don't have to go back to pretending we don't need each other." Martha hugged her daughter tightly, remembering the months when such physical affection had seemed impossible across the chasm of pride and misunderstanding that had separated them. "I know, honey. And Sarah, thank you for coming back. Thank you for not giving up on us." That night, Martha settled into her evening routine with a sense of contentment that had seemed unimaginable during those dark months in Bakersfield. She no longer needed a comfort object to help her sleep. The pillows on her bed were simply pillows, chosen for support rather than sentiment. But before turning off the lights, she spoke quietly to Tom's photograph on her nightstand, a practice she'd maintained but transformed. "We made it through, Tom," she whispered to his smiling face. "It wasn't the way either of us planned, but we made it through. Sarah's okay, the grandkids are healthy, and I'm not alone anymore. Your gift didn't work out the way you intended, but somehow it led me back to the living. I think you'd be proud of how this all turned out." Outside her window, Seattle's lights twinkled in the darkness, and Martha fell asleep to the sounds of a city full of people, some struggling, some thriving, but none of them facing their challenges in the kind of isolation that had nearly destroyed her. Tomorrow would bring new calls at the Advocacy Center, new opportunities to transform her suffering into support for others, and another day of the life she'd almost lost to pride and parasites and the complicated nature of love itself. The scars on her forehead had become part of her story, visible reminders that survival sometimes requires letting go of the very things we thought we couldn't live without, and that healing, both physical and emotional, was rarely a solitary journey. Martha's journey from isolation to community reminds us that our greatest struggles often become our most powerful gifts to others. At 67, she discovered that the pride that kept her safe also kept her suffering, alone with infected wounds, choosing between medication and electricity, too stubborn to reach out when love surrounded her. The pillow Tom gave her with such tenderness nearly killed her, but it also led her back to living. Sometimes we must destroy the very things we think connect us to love in order to truly honor that love's intention. Martha learned that accepting help isn't surrender, it's courage. Her scars became badges of survival, her story a lifeline for other seniors facing impossible choices between dignity and survival. Today, she helps dozens of elderly Americans navigate healthcare battles, proving that our worst days can become our greatest purpose. The isolation that nearly destroyed her transformed into connection that now sustains entire communities. Martha's coffee cup is no longer set for a ghost. It's surrounded by neighbors, family, and the knowledge that vulnerability shared is strength multiplied. What comfort object in your life might be keeping you from reaching out for help? Have you ever chosen pride over asking family for support when you truly needed it? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.